So a fascist, a bigot, and a misogynist walk into a bar, and the bartender says, "Good evening, sir. Dining alone again?" That is an anti-fascist dad joke, and I'm Matthew Remski, and this is the Antifascist Dad podcast. It's your waypoint for lore, strategy, and wisdom from way back then, but also right now. You can follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram at Matthew Remski, and you can check out Patreon/Antifascist Dad podcast as well, where I post full versions of main feed interviews, also a monthly audio essay, and I'm around to chat on most days. So today is going to be the first of what I imagine will be an occasional series of basics episodes that will start to nail down the ideas and terms that I'll be using here and with my guests. Fascism can be complicated when you get into the big books and old arguments, and there are good reasons to study all of that stuff in detail if you can. But I wrote this upcoming book with the belief that any idea, no matter how heavy, can be made accessible with the right attitude and tools. And one of those tools is talking about important words. So that is the job today and for the rest of this series. And by the way, I will be using notes from this upcoming book as I go, and I'll be recording several of these before the book is out, so they'll also serve as a bit of a preview. Now, for some of you, this material might be old hat, and you can let me know how I've done in the comments. Others might know the basics, but be happy for a brain reset. And then there's a third group that might be new to this altogether, and to you guys, I would say, please be skeptical. And if there's anything that doesn't smell right in what I say, or in the references I give, or the picture that I paint, please call me out on that, and I'll try to answer as best I can and make corrections if need be. Okay, so why focus on basic terms? In general, when we deal with the most common terms of political history, we face some trouble. On one hand, there are some very important terms that a lot of people believe they clearly understand, but also have many different meanings and applications, especially through history. An easy example might be that if I say the word Republican, you might think of the current GOP, or you might even daydream a little bit about the difference between Trump's GOP and more traditional Republicans, meaning those who came right before him. But Republican as a term was also used by the new government of Spain in 1931, which was formed after the overthrow of a right-wing military dictator. Those Republicans went on to organize the International Brigade of Volunteer Anti-Fascist Fighters who tried to beat back the fascist General Franco, starting in 1937. Now, about 10 years before that, the Irish Republicans gained their independence from the British Empire. So, what exactly does Republican mean? On this podcast, I'm going to pay careful attention to adding context to every squishy word like this, because when that doesn't happen, the basic logic of anti-fascism, which should be clear if we want to act on it, can also get squishy. And that doesn't really help anybody. And the other thing that can happen is that abstracted words can start to lump people together into cartoonish groups. And that's good to be aware of, especially when your whole thing is about identifying fascism and fascists, which are terms that sometimes we can stop thinking about if we just throw them around to describe people we don't like. So we'll get to those terms soon. But first, I want to go basic, starting with a definition of the system that governs our basic material circumstances, which is capitalism. Let's start with what it's not. It's not buying things. It's not selling things, not in itself. It's not even money, per se. It's not the farmer's market or the lemonade stand in themselves. It's not having a car or needing to fill it with gas. It's not me getting paid through Patreon by supporters of the work that I do. And I think we need to start there, because we have to see the difference between living in capitalism, within which all of these activities take place, and using capitalist logic and law and morality to actively exploit your neighbors. Now, the question of how capitalist you are as a person gets a little bit tricky in the context of wealth inequality, in which you can wind up exploiting people without even being aware of it. For instance, if you live in the global north, as I do, the capitalism you live under, just by living your life, is exploiting people in the global south, people you will never meet. And at this moment, There isn't really any way around that. But we can put that aside with the following question. Would you have ever chosen to live in a world in which that is just the way things are? And if you wouldn't have, then you're probably not acting or thinking like a capitalist, and you probably wouldn't want to. And so then the question can be a little bit clearer, which is, how would you act if given the choice? So how do real capitalists act? In brief, they act as if the following ideas are moral. They make sense, and they will all work out in the end just fine, and they won't lead to social struggle or environmental disaster. So first, they believe that private ownership of the means of production, factories, land, resources, that's just fine. Those things can be held in the hands of single individuals who reap all of the profits from those enterprises. They believe in free market exchange, where competition determines the value of things. They believe that the profit motive is the primary driver of human behavior. It's why we do things. They believe that there's no hard limit on how much production can increase, that there is no hard limit on how much wealth can or should be extracted and concentrated into the hands of those who own the means of production, the factories, the resources, etc. So those are the core beliefs and logical premises, and we see them enacted everywhere around us, protected by laws, promoted by governments, and then enforced by the police when people get out of line. But there's a lot of stuff that is not on that list. The things that are not factored into the belief systems of capitalism are things like sharing, generosity, solidarity, taking care of those who need care, domestic labor, emotional labor, preserving the environment, ensuring everyone has housing, employment, healthcare, and leisure time. And here's the truly weird part to me. Every value that is not on that list is not only basic to a life of meaning, but we can see some or all of these values institutionalized in most forms of social organization, from the family to the neighborhood to your local church, and even in some forms of business. So one of the strange things about capitalism is that as it grows in influence, it displaces and overrides and hollows out pre-existing forms of human sharing. And I think it leaves a lot of us feeling as though we live in a double world. So let's get to the heart of the matter, because that first point and that list of values, private ownership is okay. Private ownership of the means of production, factories, land, resources, it really defines the core logic going on. So what does private ownership actually mean? Why does it create exploitation? And this is where understanding some basic leftist thought is handy. And don't worry, I'll define left in a moment. Let's say a person owns a workshop filled with the tools one needs to make chairs. Well, first of all, how did that happen? Let's just set that aside for the moment. The workshop owner also owns a little forest, and they can cut and mill lumber to make chairs. And this means that they have started out with what's called the means of production, or everything they need to make a chair except labor. So, needing labor, they go out and find a carpenter who's an expert at making chairs, and they offer to pay her a certain rate of money for her time and skill. Now, the carpenter, who is looking for work to make money for food and shelter for her family, agrees to trade her labor for wages, because that's all she owns, her labor. She does not own the means of production. She might have her own hand tools here and there, but for the most part, she does not own everything that is needed to make the chair, so she has to trade her labor in this process for money. Now, we're still not really doing capitalism fully yet, but it is coming. So let's say that the cost for the workshop, is $20 for a certain amount of time for the owner to maintain and heat the space and keep the tools sharp and mill the lumber needed to make a chair. So let's imagine that the cost of the factory for making the chair during the time in which the labor will be applied to making it costs $20. Let's say that the owner agrees to pay the carpenter $10 an hour to make the chair. And let's say that the whole process takes 4 hours. So the whole thing is going to cost $60 to make, and the only way that that enterprise is worth it to the shop owner is if he can take the chair to the market and sell it for more than that $60. Now, let's say he's able to sell the chair for $120. Now that's pretty good. It's not always going to work out like that. Sometimes he's going to lose money on the actual sale of the manufactured product. But let's say that in this instance, he makes $120. That means after paying his expenses in the carpenter, he now has $60 in profit in his hand. Now, the answers to the following questions are really important in determining the course of history. The questions will be something like, what should happen with that $60? Where does it come from? Who does it belong to? Now, according to the capitalist logic of private ownership, the owner of the shop, who has made all of the decisions so far, should now be free to take that profit and spend it on what they like. Or they can use it as capital, there's our word, to expand chair-making operations and to expand their profits. And at that point, that profit becomes the capital in capitalism. Okay, so with capital privately owned, the shop owner can build more shops to make more chairs that create similar levels of profit. And in this system, they are allowed and encouraged to keep the carpenter's wages steady and not share with her the growing pot of wealth. And if they really go all in, the owner will typically attempt to decrease those wages by demanding that the carpenter works harder or faster or for longer hours. Or he will say, you know, I kind of got this robot that might be able to make chairs. Do you think you can do it any faster or any cheaper? But what made that $60 in profit possible? The shop and the tools and the owner's management are important, but a crucial component was the labor of the carpenter, and she was paid according to the labor agreement, but will not share in the profit her labor produced. So here's one of those questions. Is it fair for the shop owner to profit more than the carpenter? Capitalists will argue that the shop owner takes on the risks of production and innovation and should be rewarded for that. Okay, but then anti-capitalists ask, how much reward? They say the typical distribution of surplus value or the profit from the enterprise means that workers get legally exploited. The morality of the system allows them to be paid less for their time and skill than their time and skill is worth, and actually less and less over time. Now, because the worker does not own the shop and the tools, they can be paid far less than what the market pays for the results of their labor. And through the process of accumulating the results of that exploited labor, the owner can become very wealthy. Now, this inequality can lead to misery. It can be socially unsustainable. It can lead to resentment, bitter competition, and crisis. And I want you to put a pin in that word crisis, because in the next Basics episode, I'll come back to it, because one definition of fascism I'll be using is rooted in the idea that capitalism messes people up so badly that they lose their minds in resentment and organize into armies of retribution under strongmen who promise to restore their stolen wealth and stolen glory. So this presentation of the morality of profit, this very critical view, it begins with simple arithmetic, but it ends in the poetry of vampires, because we're not just talking about a money equation, we're talking about the worker's entire relationship with time. And here's where it gets gruesome. So, the labor of the carpenter on Monday creates value that the owner can use to expand operations on Tuesday. By contrast, all the carpenter owns, beyond whatever wages they are able to save, is their body and time and skill, which remain useful only in the present moment. The worker's capacities will decline as they age, while the owner's wealth grows. And by appropriating the surplus value of the carpenter's labor, the owner continues to profit on what the carpenter has sold away, which is her past efforts. So this dead labor is the very essence of capital frozen into an object. So consider this kind of zombie scenario. When that capital appropriated from the carpenter is used to upgrade the shop or open a second shop to increase chair production, the carpenter's past value creation is being used to set the terms of her future work. Her dead labor is controlling her future labor and that of all of her comrades. And that's why some people have compared capital to a vampire that sucks the blood out of the living. Now, all of this leads to some pretty obvious questions. What if everyone owned the past fruits of their labor equally? What if we organized things so that everyone together owned the shop and the tools and exercised stewardship over the forest? Would it be better if everyone together shared in the management of the shop and the surplus value of the chair making? If the profit motive leads to expanded operations in the production of a chair or anything else, are there any limits on what the shop owner can accumulate? And then finally, what would stop the shop owner from destroying entire forests in the hope of profiting from more chairs? And is the reinvestment of capital a problem for the environment? Now, capitalists will argue that people are rational in pursuing their own self-interests, and that nobody wants to ruin the planet, that would be dumb, and that market competition will lead to the invention of climate change solutions. Anti-capitalists say, well, let's look around us. How's that going? Okay, 3 more basic terms today: right-wing, liberal, and left-wing. And I'm putting them here because over the past few centuries, they have developed to represent the spectrum of political responses to capitalism, from woohoo, let's go, on one side, to this is not working and we have to change it on the other side, with a further subset on that side defined by questions like, well, how fast must we change it and how much force should we apply? And I think clarity on these terms is crucial in the present context, because in the era of the culture wars, right and left get thrown around mainly as cultural terms, and then what's worse than that is that left and liberal get blended together in ways that erase any real sort of differentiation with regard to how they respond to capitalism. And there's a history there that explains why that happened, and I'll touch on that in a future episode. Right wing first. In general, if a person is on the right or has conservative politics, their bias is to try to preserve things as they have known them to be. And sometimes they will appeal to the value of tradition in this aim, but sometimes the traditions of conservatism are either invented or they are exaggerated visions of some sort of golden past. Now, put a flag in that, because this becomes an acute fixation of fascists, or the belief that way back in our history there was a point of perfection and order that's been lost. And often there's a psychology involved that is nostalgic or perhaps overlaps with missing one's childhood. Now, there is a positive side, I think, because the conservative impulse to protect things can also foster a certain patience with relationships and a kind of faith that things can improve without necessarily being broken first. And I'll give one example that I'm familiar with. I grew up Catholic, but I left the church in the 1980s because of its social views towards gay people and its failure to address the legacy of colonialism and the abuse of children. Now, those things have not been fixed, and so I'm not going back. I can't really stand it. I would be thinking about those things all of the time and not be able to concentrate on the other aspects of what was on offer. But those issues also have progressed or changed a little bit over the last few decades, partly because people who are more conservative in temperament than me chose to stay and push for change within the organization in ways that also preserved their community life. Now, what's the result? It's a church that is influenced by Pope Francis's more welcoming legacy towards the queer world, his advocacy for the environment, and his critique of capitalism. And these are all things that seem like they will be carried on by the current Pope Leo. Now, as a leftist, I would prefer that these things change much more quickly. But on the other hand, I know that if this institution hangs together through compromise and a certain devotion to custom, it can get to the point where 1.8 billion people in the world are under the devotional influence of somebody telling them that capitalism is destroying the planet and genocide is bad. And that is not something any leftist organization I'm aware has the clout to achieve. So that's a good, but I think also paradoxical example of the power of conservatism, because the scope of the problem with it as an attitude is measured by what it is applied to. And when it's applied to a fake custom or invented tradition, like capitalism, and fosters this feeling that, well, this is always the way things have been and they can't be otherwise, we get into delusional territory. Now, that territory on the right has several sectors. Right-wingers or conservatives tend to believe that it is not good for people to organize really collectively. And the main target of that belief is this fear of the overbearing state. And that is reasonable in some ways, but the output of the belief is an emphasis on hyper-individualism and personal responsibility over private property, which of course is okay to them, and resources. Their idea is that if you let markets run without interference or regulation, things will work out for the majority of people. If everyone pursues their self-interest through the profit motive, things will shake out okay. And this is where I'll flag an old leftist argument first made by Walter Benjamin about the relationship between capitalism and religion. And I'll go more deeply into it in another Basics episode. But his point was that to be a capitalist, you really have to have faith in a bunch of irrational ideas in order to believe that protecting the system will protect society or culture or keep us all safe. Liberalism. If we move leftwards on this continuum, away from right-wing or conservative attitudes, we arrive in a middle ground we can call liberalism. And in that space, people shed themselves of a number of conservative fantasies about the past. They acknowledge problems with the inequalities of capitalism or patriarchy or racism, but they generally defend much of the core logic that drives capitalism: private property, individual rights, and the basic okayness of the profit motive. Liberals are often very good at identifying and highlighting the excesses of capitalist monsters like Henry Ford or Elon Musk, but they also tend to believe in the power of persuasion, that through education and manners and good cultural practices, we can encourage capitalism to be less destructive and to help us unfold our true potentials. Now, there is a conservative and often wishful thinking attitude towards the resilience of institutions and social norms that often expresses itself in a kind of almost religious belief in the goodness of the nation, and that people will eventually behave in enlightened ways, but we must never force the issue. So don't get too angry, don't ruffle too many feathers, don't protest too hard, because you could suffer a lot of blowback. Things will be okay. There's a lot to say on how the naivety of liberalism fails to confront fascism. It's a classic historical fact that when push comes to shove, liberal governments and media empires don't really choose to stand firmly against fascists. Their preference is to strike deals with them and sometimes even flatter those in power. Liberals tend to hope that by appealing to manners and social norms, capitalists will agree to be a little less evil. And so I will get to that in the next Basics about fascism. But for now, the central point with regard to capitalism is that the liberal position functions as a relief valve that dissipates the discontent of those most abused by capitalism. Now, the way that this function is most easily understood, I think, is in the realm of civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from Birmingham jail, addresses the liberal tendency to always apologize for the status quo in the hope that somehow things will improve. He uses the word moderate in the following passage, which for this purpose we can consider synonymous with liberal. He writes, quote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Now, translated to address the issue of capitalism, we could say that the liberal is more devoted to maintaining the status quo than to changing it, even while those who are most directly affected continue to suffer. But the tricky thing is that unlike the right-winger, they agree that things must change, but they either disclaim the responsibility and power it would take to change things, or they worry that changing things too quickly would destabilize too many parts of the society. So, in my opinion, I think the liberals' strongest argument is in the appeal to human nature. The liberal is willing to both acknowledge the pain of capitalism, but also maintain the capitalist framework by aiming for equal opportunity, but accepting some level of inequality is just going to be inevitable. Nobody really wants there to be injustice, they say, but it will happen as a byproduct of market systems. And in that, I hear a tacit encouragement to say, well, you know human beings. They will always be competitive and non-cooperative, and we just have to accept a certain amount of bad behavior. Nobody's perfect. So, liberalism is truly a middle ground position, which is why leftists, which I'm getting to, sometimes call them squishes. And it's why one of Pete Seeger's most famous songs during the Great Depression was called What Side Are You On? And it was about the fork in the road during any crisis between capitalists and workers. Are you going to unionize and wield collective power, or are you going to cross the picket line and try to make your own deal with the bosses? Okay, so now we get to leftism. Now, that question asked by Pete Seeger, I think, pushes us over this shining red line. And on one side of the line, the question is, well, is capitalism reformable? And on the other side of that line, the feeling is, no, it should be dismantled. And if you cross over that line into that it must be dismantled space, how will that happen? What will take the place of capitalism? The leftist orientation is that before you cross over that line, as a reformist, you are usually thinking about ways of preserving exploitation and inequality in more acceptable forms. It may not be your intention. You may not want to be doing that, but you're kind of stuck with that as your ceiling. Okay, so there are countless really intelligent arguments over the past centuries about the degree to which liberals or leftists have an accurate view of capitalism, history, and human nature. There's arguments about which position leads to more progress in human rights and equality. And certainly when it comes to large-scale economic systems, those arguments get complicated, and it's easy for advocates of one persuasion or the other to find evidence for their positions. But I think there are three areas in which leftist intolerance for capitalism proves itself to be generally correct. So, global inequality, environmental crisis, and the conditions for fascism. Okay, so as I've mentioned, I'll get to defining fascism in the next basics episode, but starting with global inequality, here's the lowdown. Researchers estimate that since 1960, global North countries have appropriated $152 trillion worth of capital from the global South. That number represents the value of things extracted like oil, minerals, and food. It includes debt payments on development loans issued by global North banks, and it includes labor hours. How many labor hours? In 2021, the global North appropriated 826 billion hours of labor from the global South. That labor doubled the available labor the global North already had at its disposal, and it prevented the global South from using that labor in its place of origin. So those labor hours, instead of helping to develop global South culture and interests, were captured to make the stuff that people in the global North buy and use on a daily basis. How did this happen? Through political and capitalist dominance rooted in colonialism, and now perpetuated through global financial systems like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, where global North countries exert majority voting power. This imbalance is visible in two final statistics to consider. Researchers find that global South wages are up to 95% lower than global North wages for work of equal skill. And while global South workers do 90% of the manufacturing labor in the world, they receive only 21% of global income. Okay, that's global inequality. Let's look at the environment. Look around. We have known about environmental destruction for over 50 years, and we have relied on ethical capitalists and liberal reforms to try to make a dent in the crisis. And we haven't. People living by the profit motive and insisting on private ownership and a deregulated system of government will not and cannot solve the very crisis this system created. Wrapping up, when I and most of my guests on this podcast use terms like capitalism, right, liberal, and left, this is where we're coming from. So I hope that's helpful. So the next Basics episode will focus on defining fascism in political terms, but it will link to these topics because how we define fascism has a lot to do with how we define capitalism, liberalism, and right-to-left politics. So I'll see you then. So please subscribe and share this around if you find it helpful, and I'd love to hear your questions and comments. Now, I want you to be aware that I do instantly block trolls, not only because I'm a dad and in that one area I don't have time for your bullshit, young man, but also because my job is to create a fun and welcoming space to talk about how to deal with bullies in the schoolyard and the government. I'll see you soon.